Before we begin, I just want to clarify real quick that this video is about the first Sonic the Hedgehog game released in 1991, and not about the franchise or character as a whole. I know the name is a little confusing, but this video is focused almost entirely on the first game, and future videos I make for this series will cover the respective games they share names with. Are we good? Alrighty then. Realistically, very few video game characters have managed to breach the gaming zeitgeist and elevate themselves to truly become iconic and recognisable media characters to the world at large. If I showed my mum a picture of Master Chief, she might call him Halo at best. If I showed her Johnny Silverhand, she'd probably just call him Keanu Reeves. And the odds that she's able to realistically tell me who Andrew Ryan is are pretty much nil. I mean, I would genuinely be impressed if she even got close to guessing that name. But there are certainly a fair few characters who have breached the realm of video game and have become internationally recognised icons in their own right, be it due to a popular design or by becoming vast intermedia properties. The best example is of course Mario, who is so iconic that even just the red letter M gives people feelings of warmth and nostalgia, but his story started with a fierce rivalry, with a character who I hold much dearer to my heart. A character who is, in his own way, just as recognisable as Mr. Video Games himself, and the character who appeared first in one of my Is Legendary videos before any other video game character, despite that video being about Mass Effect. Sonic the Hedgehog has had a very tumultuous and varied history. From his inception in 1991 through to modern day, he has had some great games, some okay games, and yeah, he's had his ups and downs, but through all of it he has managed to maintain his status as a cultural icon. Whether this is primarily due to clever marketing from Sega keeping his rivalry with Mario alive, through a devotion from fans to those beloved games, or through several TV shows, comic series, and more recently a full-on movie franchise, Sonic endures, and he has cemented himself as a staple video game icon, even having crossovers with other beloved characters like Mario himself, or Mega Man, Minecraft Steve, or Joker Persona 5, and more than once for each of them, but it all starts with a little game back on the Sega Mega Drive. I am British, we call it the Mega Drive, not the Genesis, but Genesis is a way cooler name, hence why the next chapter is called... In 1983, the video game market globally crashed, with the industry plummeting to its near demise at the hands of companies like Atari pumping out low-quality and rushed games. In 1985, the medium was basically considered a short-lived gimmick that the world was ready to move on from, at least in North America and Europe, with a Japanese company named Nintendo coming out of the woodwork with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan, cleverly marketing it towards children and even advertising it early on as a system to enhance toys with a little robot and a light gun to play with. As the NES grew in popularity, competitors rose to the scene. Atari themselves tried their hand at the console market again, and SNK developed some pretty cool ideas later on too, but before the modern times of the PlayStation and the Xbox, the primary competitor for Nintendo in the console space was none other than Sega. Their first console, the Sega Master System, is not really worth talking about here because it's largely irrelevant to Sonic, but it made enough waves with titles such as Alex Kidd, Sega's at the time presumed to be mascot, being popular enough to embolden Sega to get ahead of the curve on Nintendo. The NES and Master System were both what are referred to as 8-bit consoles, which is a fancy way of saying they could only run games that looked like this. At the time, this was still pretty revolutionary, but the technology was there to go even further beyond, to double the bits and produce a game that looked like this. Enter the 16-bit generation of consoles, with Sega beating Nintendo to the punch by a whopping 2 whole years, with even the very first Sonic the Hedgehog game predating the North American launch of Nintendo's 16-bit console by over a month. This rivalry between the companies then spread to their mascots, with Sonic the Hedgehog being bragged about for some nonsense they referred to as blast processing, a fancy way of saying that the game lets you go real quick, and Sega stepping it up further to proclaim proudly that, in reference to their generational leap, Sega does what Nintendo don't. And as the sales for Sonic skyrocketed, with Sega taking such a huge market share away from Nintendo thanks to the Mega Drive and its new flagship franchise Sonic, things were looking up for Sega. Since I already covered how Sonic is still beloved to this day, with a ravenous, sometimes too ravenous fanbase that covered his games, especially these early ones, it really begs the question, was this era of Genesis Sonic actually any good? This is the part where normally I would do a pretty thorough breakdown of the story of a game, talking through all the plot points and sharing my opinions on some things that I think were handled really well, or areas I feel could have been improved. The story of the first Sonic game, aptly titled Sonic the Hedgehog, goes as such. Sonic likes animals and fights to protect them. Dr. Eggman comes along and puts the animals inside of his evil robots named Badniks, and uses them to cause chaos in hopes of stealing some magical gems called the Chaos Emeralds. Sonic doesn't like this, and so he sets out to stop him, and in the end, Sonic stops him and saves the day. and that's the entire plot. These old 2D games oftentimes don't really have a whole lot going on story-wise, and early Sonic is for sure no exception, as things don't really get much more advanced or interesting than that until a few games down the line with Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Instead, these games are very much gameplay first, and that's where a lot of games from this era really shine, with Sonic the Hedgehog being no exception. Sonic's gameplay is simple, and really harkens back to that blast processing gimmick that they used in marketing, with the general idea being that other platformers of the time, such as Mario himself, who's known for more precise and methodical platforming, and you can certainly go fast in Mario games, but the games are primarily designed in such a way that they're typically just as fun if you're going at a more intermediate pace, to make them extremely accessible to all players, while having enough varied gimmicks and concepts to allow the games to be fun throughout. Instead of this, Sonic opts to prioritise lightning fast gameplay, where the ideal game plan is for you to go at ludicrous speeds throughout the entire game, with the game itself honestly sometimes struggling to keep up with its camera. The fact that the very first stage of the game, Green Hill Zone Act 1, can be finished in like 30 seconds if you're good enough and know what you're doing is testament to the gameplay design that going fast is the reward. You won't be able to do it quite that quickly the first time you play. You have to earn it, and then when you earn those really fast, really fun flow states where the intended roller coaster ride of the level takes you along perfectly because you have perfected the art, it becomes the most satisfying and enjoyable platforming game there is, in my opinion, with this first level being the best possible showcase to people unfamiliar with Sonic's gameplay to see just how fun it can be, which is why it's such a crying shame that the rest of this first game is just not great. And I think that this game suffers for a lot of the same reasons that I found Halo Combat Evolved to be lacking compared to other Bungie Halo titles, that being that they just haven't refined the idea yet. 90s platformers can be infamous for staggering difficulty spikes as the game progresses, getting more and more difficult to ensure multiple playthroughs and to encourage absolute perfection of its players. For a level like Green Hill, this repetition serves as a great reward, whereby players will get very much used to playing it and no doubt grow more and more attached, especially so considering the original Mega Drive version of the game didn't have saves of any sort, and you had to play the entire game from start to finish in a single sitting. So when, from the very second level of the game, the level designers made the critical mistake of removing the satisfying perfection of Sonic's ludicrous speed away from you to instead have you sit and wait for slow-moving platforms over lava pits, things get less enjoyable pretty quickly. Sure, the ring mechanic in Sonic, whereby you lose your currently held rings when damaged and can continue to infinitely take damage provided you have even but a single ring remaining, can make almost any damage mitigatable in the long run, but you can't over-rely on a dwindling ring supply to cheese through everything. You will eventually have to wait on platforms if you want to progress. And that is just so boring. Compared to the absolute treat that was Green Hill, Marble Zone is an unadulterated snooze fest, with the remainder of the game not really improving matters very much for the most part. Spring Yard then perhaps gets a little bit worse due to its primary gimmick being its namesake springs, which perhaps unsurprisingly make you bounce around like a lunatic with little to no control over Sonic's movement, after which Labyrinth Zone takes you underwater with a timer that leads to you drowning unless you interact with air bubbles, although of course there are plenty of awkward traps along the way to ensure you remain as slow as possible. The light at the end of the tunnel is Starlight Zone, which is basically just a more challenging Green Hill, with level design focused on going fast while keeping you on your toes, which is a whole lot of fun for people who are good at the game. I consider myself to be okay at best. Scrap Brain Zone is up next and is once again pretty rubbish overall, with its third and final act basically just being the loathsome Labyrinth Zone once again, which is used as a method to segue the game into its appropriately named Final Zone, where the game deprives the player of any rings and forces them to fight Eggman in an arguably climactic boss battle, which I suppose is something I have neglected to talk about. That being that every zone's third act, with the exception of Scrap Brain, features a boss battle against Dr. Eggman in one of his machines. The first boss is just a big swinging wrecking ball, the second a floating fireball machine, Spring Yard gives a machine with a big spike to destroy the bridge you're standing on, Labyrinth is more of a chase sequence through a vertical lane filled with traps, and Starlight drops explosive balls onto seesaws that you have to use to return them to sender and blow him up, while the final fight sees Eggman literally just stood inside of big old pistons that instantly crush you to death should you get in their way, with you having to jump into the side of them to damage him. Each enemy and each boss has a name, as does each animal friend, although other than Motorbug and Flicky, none of the names really caught on or matter much. Like this guy, who used to be called Cucky. As a whole, the boss battles are largely inoffensive, with some of them even being more enjoyable in my opinion than the majority of the stages themselves, and it just adds to that solid foundation that has you simply have Sonic curl into a spike ball and launch himself onto the bald man's head, and it leaves them with endless possibilities to expand on the gameplay concept in future titles. As for the stuff that isn't the boss battles or level-to-level gameplay, well, the game has special stages with these delightfully psychedelic backdrops where you have to awkwardly maneuver Sonic to the centre to gather a Chaos Emerald. You enter one of the special stages by finishing an act with 50 or more rings and entering the Big Boy ring at the end of the stage. Originally, these were quite punishing, and since they weren't able to appear in an Act 3, you end up with a pretty low number of chances to actually enter a special stage, which just demands another layer of perfection from the player. Honestly, perhaps too much with the original design intention of the game, with very limited lives, because you have to collect all 6 Chaos Emeralds across 10 acts, and then survive the barely comprehensible drop into a janky and unintuitive maze. I'm not a great fan of these original special stages, with perhaps my least favourite part being that the reward of a Chaos Emerald is meaningless. They don't do anything other than change the ending text of the game to be more congratulatory over demeaning. But that's kind of it for the special stages in the first game, as I don't want to talk about the Chaos Emeralds too much as they get a lot more interesting next time around. But it is an extra layer of gameplay you can strive for if you want a bit more challenge out of this first game. So yeah, the story is nothing much to speak of and the gameplay is a mixed bag at best. But in spite of that, I would still argue that it's a pretty great game overall. There is to this day still a lot of fun to experience, especially for the first time. It just hasn't aged gracefully by any means, but its problems do not attest to the legacy that this game has. For the time, it was revolutionary. It showed that a platforming game could go very quickly, evolve the way that a game could look compared to Nintendo consoles, and sparked a generational war between two companies that would last over a decade until Sega pulled out of the console race following the poor sales of their following 2 consoles. This first game, it's okay, it's fine even, but what Sonic later grew into in future titles, that's legendary. Frankly, that would have been a perfectly poignant spot to end the video and lead nicely into the Sonic 2 video, which of course is going to have a much more positive outlook, if not also being a considerably shorter video, which is pretty unprecedented in these parts. But the Sonic fanbase is ravenous, they're unhinged at times, and they will notice the most minor discrepancies, flaws and issues to nitpick upon until the end of time. And I can't blame them, because we all love to be pedantic from time to time, and we all love to protect the media we hold dearest. Which is why I must admit with a heavy heart that yes, I played and recorded this footage via the Sonic Origins Plus remaster of the game, originally released in 2022, which is but one of many re-releases of the classic 2D Sonic games from throughout the years. The reason I chose these specific versions is pretty simple though. Sonic Origins gets a lot of discussions levied its way and a lot of vitriol for presenting imperfect versions of the 4 classic 2D Sonic games. The ports are a little lazy, there's a few bugs and such that weren't in the originals, and to some people the games just feel a little off or that they need some tweaking. In no way am I claiming that Sonic Origins presents the absolute 100% best and most definitive version of the classic games to play. The first game in particular adds mechanics that simply didn't exist in the original version of the game, like the spin dash introduced in Sonic 2 and the drop dash introduced in the distant future of Sonic Mania. And while these things can be disabled, there are some minor nuisances that people have with the games, which cannot be removed within game settings. The reason I chose Sonic Origins as opposed to the other options available is actually pretty simple. It is because it's very accessible. Let's say I was going to try and convince somebody who isn't all that interested in Sonic to give the Sonic series a go. Am I going to convince that person that searching for an unregistered download link on a website they aren't familiar with is a better option than buying a game available on Steam and every major console? As an example, I have a young nephew who is getting into gaming thanks to my gamer brother introducing him, and if I was going to indoctrinate this poor lad into the Sonic community, then am I really going to be able to get a 7-year-old to actively enjoy finding the best way to play Sonic 1? Sonic Origins' biggest strength is that it's just there. It's readily available, it goes on sale pretty regularly, and I didn't have to download any other stuff to get the game working in a way that to a casual enough gamer would feel better than just base emulation probably would, thanks to widescreen support and the aforementioned gameplay features from future titles helping give a bit more speed back to those slower levels. And even with all that, if I still really wanted to rectify those minute issues, there are mods available for free that you can find online to make these versions even closer to the originals, or add dozens of ways to at least customize the experience to your personal preferences. Much like Sonic 1 itself, Sonic Origins isn't perfect, but it's fine, and for the purpose of recording footage for this video, I really can't complain. My original plan for this video did not have a chapter like this, but as I was part way through the editing, it dawned on me that I never much discussed the actual creation of Sonic the Hedgehog, with that earlier chapter being largely about what led to his creation, and the legacy he has now, rather than his origins. Which begs the question as to why they made a hedgehog of all animals the fastest thing alive. And the truth is, underwhelmingly, that Sega simply wanted to pivot away from Alex Kidd as a mascot due to him being a short and stout human much like Mario, with the intention of creating a character who would be radically different to Mario. They started off with a rabbit who would throw items around with elongated ears, till eventually a trio of Sega employees named Naoto Oshima, Yuji Naka, and Hirokazu Yasuhara, I apologise if any of those pronunciations weren't right, got attached to the idea of a fast-paced and simple game, with a mechanic where you can roll into a bowl, which in turn shortlisted the animal choices down to an armadillo or a hedgehog, and as you probably know, they opted for the hedgehog, beginning the work on what was originally called Mr. Hedgehog, often mistranslated as Mr. Needlemouse. At a similar time, the idea for Eggman came about based on drawings by Oshima for a sleepy old fella, and with the trio having a keen focus on designing a character who would be cool and appeal primarily to an audience outside of Japan, especially focusing on the USA, they finalised the design and name of Sonic the Hedgehog to get him to appear in his first ever video game, Radmobile, following it up shortly thereafter with the game we just covered. Interestingly, despite the character being designed with the US in mind, the designs for Sonic and Eggman were actually quite different between the US and international versions. The international design more closely resembles a stubbier and cuter version of the same dude we know today, while the US design stylized his quills as a mohawk. America also renamed Eggman to Robotnik and gave him these crazy black eyes. This in turn led to a bit of discourse when the mohawk and Robotnik stuff was later phased out in the franchise's life to settle on the more sprite-accurate look of classic Sonic with his standard quills and to settle on the name of Eggman worldwide. Though while the mohawk and Eggman's black eye stayed in the 90s, the name Robotnik would continue on as Eggman's legal name, with Eggman just being a moniker he goes by like it's his supervillain name, where Otto Octavius is Dr. Octopus, Ivo Robotnik is Dr. Eggman, which now more than covers the characters of this game and leads quite nicely to our conclusion. This was a pretty short video. Comparing it to the other ludicrously long things I have done thus far on this channel, something this short and sweet was really nice. I look forward to discussing the future Sonic games because I really think that my statement stands that Sonic 1 sets a solid foundation that is pretty much incrementally improved upon throughout every game in Sonic Origins, and that this hypothesis is something that will become readily apparent throughout the games. Future titles focus more heavily on that speed and the fun level design and less on Labyrinth Zone, but at least this game still had a fantastic soundtrack that has softly accompanied this video, and as the second game would already expand on Sonic's cast, world, abilities and story, I do still love that this game set a great baseline to expand upon. For what it is and what it establishes, I think anyone who disparages Sonic 1 entirely is incorrect, because while it is easily the weakest of this original Mega Drive series of games, it's also fundamentally important in establishing 35 years and counting of the fastest thing alive.
It's a supersonic